I just got my results back from the hospital. The doctor said I could go into heart failure at any moment. Still in shock, I came home to find my suitcase sitting outside the door. My son looked at me, his voice cold. My wife and I don't want to see you anymore. 3 weeks later, he asked if I'd changed my mind. I just smiled and placed a stack of papers on the table. I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. I am Margaret Turner, 63 years old, a widow. Today, I had my regular heart checkup at the hospital. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the metallic clang of a rolling cart cut through the hallway. The doctor pulled up a chair across from me, looked me straight in the eye. Your heart is getting weaker, he said slowly, clearly. You should avoid stress, get proper rest, and take your medication on schedule. I nodded, swallowing hard. He handed me an envelope with the results and a black and white instruction sheet for the medication. No unnecessary words of comfort. I didn't ask any questions either. One deep breath. I told myself, go home, see the kids, take the medicine, lie down, make the next appointment tomorrow. Things will get better. I slipped the envelope into my cloth bag and stepped through the revolving door. My heartbeat was steady, a bit fast but still under control. On the bus, my mind wandered endlessly, thinking through every possible outcome, good and bad. But I stayed calm because I still had something to lean on, my family. As long as I get home, see my children, rest a bit, everything will be fine. I repeated that sentence like a prayer. The bus stopped near my neighborhood. I stood up, my shoulders sagging slightly from the weight of my bag and the pouch of pills. The wooden steps on my porch still creaked the same way they always did when someone stepped on them. I reached for the handrail and saw a suitcase sitting beside the flower pot. My suitcase. The zipper was frayed. On top of it lay my heart medicine box, right next to my sleep bag, as if someone had neatly packed me up, ready to be sent away. I pulled out my keys, but before I could fit them into the lock, the door opened. Ethan stood there, my son, 35 years old, broad-shouldered, dark circles under his eyes from long nights working at Turner Designs. He avoided my gaze, gripping the edge of the door. My wife needs peace, he said, his tone dry. You should stay somewhere else for a while. I set my keys down. So you've decided? He didn't move an inch. If you leave, it'll be better for everyone. I didn't see Jessica anywhere. I nodded once, then bent to pick up my suitcase. Ethan stepped back, still holding the door, as if someone inside was pulling it shut. The door closed, the latch clicked softly. My heartbeat changed shallow, quick. I stood there for a moment on the porch, smelling the damp wood and the faint scent of my old coat. Without a word, I turned and rolled the suitcase down the steps. On the walkway, my shadow stretched long. I could hear the suitcase wheels screeching faintly against the concrete. I stopped, set it down, and sat on the edge of the curb. I opened my wallet, a little cash enough for a few meals, a couple of cards, a few coins, and a small notebook with phone numbers I rarely called. Taking a deep breath, I reached into my bag and pulled out the hospital envelope. My palms had left faint sweat stains along its edges. I took out the medication instructions, folded them into thirds, and tucked them into my notebook. The rest, the results, I didn't open again. Not yet. Flipping through the notebook, I stopped at a number for a senior lodging home just a few blocks away. I remembered their sign by the road to the train station. Small rooms, clean beds, regular hours. Maybe that's exactly what I needed. I dialed the number. The receptionist's calm voice asked my name and whether I needed a room tonight. I'll be there in half an hour, I said. After hanging up, I checked my watch. It wasn't dark yet. I stood, zipped my coat up another notch, and grabbed the suitcase handle. Before leaving, I held the envelope up to eye level and blew softly across the paper's edge to dry what moisture remained. I folded it neatly, tucked it back into the bag, adjusted the strap on my shoulder. The road out of the neighborhood wasn't long. I walked slowly, keeping my heartbeat steady and within reach. With each step, I reminded myself, tonight, I just need a roof, a warm cup of water, a steady breath. Tomorrow, I'll open the envelope again, but for now, I just need to walk. The room at the lodging house was so small I could touch the edge of the table just by stretching out my hand. A single bed pressed against the wall, a thin curtain drawn low. I closed the door, set my suitcase at the foot of the bed, sat down, and leaned my back against the white painted wall. I opened my cloth bag and took out my pill box, water bottle, notebook, and the little alarm I used to track my medication times. I sorted the pills into each daily slot and set the alarms on my phone. 7 a.m., 1-2 noon, 8 p.m. The bottle bumped softly against the tabletop. My hand trembled, then steadied. "Don't cry. Just breathe," I whispered, testing my own voice. Slowly, I inhaled for 4 counts, exhaled for 6. The tightness in my chest eased, not gone, but manageable. I wiped my palms dry with a tissue, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my pocket. I switched on the desk lamp and pulled my notebook closer. The grid-lined pages were clean, waiting for words. I wrote a short line. First night. Beneath it, I drew 3 empty boxes for expenses I'd record later. The pen paused on the paper. The faint smell of disinfectant still lingered in my nose, carrying me back to the afternoon. I closed my eyes, and memory spliced together like edited film cuts. The funeral home. Ethan held my hand large and warm and whispered, "I'll take care of you, Mom." I didn't nod, didn't shake my head. I only squeezed back. My husband's photo sat on the wooden stand, the yellow light soft against the glass frame. At the bank counter, I signed the first check that saved Turner Designs. Ethan had emailed me the day before. The last line read, "Mom, only you can save me." I printed the message, clipped it with the check, and handed them to him with a single reply, "Bring me the invoices tomorrow." His hands were visibly shaking as he took them. At the kitchen supply store, the clerk read my name aloud to write it on the invoice for the new cabinets and stove. I chose the model that was sturdy, nice, and reasonably priced, not too fancy, not too cheap. Thinking of the soup Jessica loved, I asked them to add an extra pull-out shelf. The bill bore my name, my signature tilting to the right. Late at night in the old kitchen, I pushed the water and electric bills aside, tallied them quickly with my pocket calculator. I wrote in the corner, "Paid." The lamp above me clicked and hummed, but didn't burn out. I opened my eyes. The neon light in this room hummed the same way. I pulled out the printed email from a file folder. The line, "Mom, only you can save me," sat in the middle of the page, black letters on white paper, bold even without being bolded. I folded it and placed it beneath the pillbox. The phone screen lit up. I opened the Messages app and typed, "I'm staying at a lodging house near home. Are you doing all right?" I stared at the words long enough to know I shouldn't send them. I highlighted, deleted. The cursor blinked. I set the phone down face first. "If you've made up your mind, anything I say now will only make things worse." I exhaled softly. Since the moment I stepped off that porch, I'd been learning to bite my tongue. Silence, sometimes, is the only safety line left. I stood and pulled the curtain open just a crack. The backyard was dark, only a single wall light casting an oval glow on the cement. The wind rustled the leaves in dry, brittle sounds. I lowered the curtain and sat back down. I wrote 3 lines, neat and straight. "Take medicine on time, eat light, avoid arguments." Then added one more. "Short morning walk." I paused. "No, that's enough for now." I closed the notebook. I poured some water, took my evening pills, and set the morning alarm. My heartbeat was steadier. I lay down, pulled the blanket up to my chest, eyes tracing the ceiling. The hum of the light faded into a soft white noise. I imagined a kitchen at dawn, warm, tidy. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary day. Sleep came late and shallow. From time to time, I startled awake at the sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall. I counted my breaths, thought about which bread would be easiest to chew for breakfast, and that I should buy more sticky notes. Small thoughts, blunt-edged ones, things I could hold without being hurt. When the alarm buzzed, it felt like I'd only just drifted off. I turned it off, sat up, and felt my body from head to toe. No dizziness, no chest pain. Good. I touched the pillbox, heard the tablets shift against each other. I opened the notebook, 3 lines from last night, standing straight, like small, firm pillars. I drew the curtain. Outside, a thin streak of light had already split the low sky. The first bird's chirp was faint, like an opening dot. I watched the clock on the desk change from 5:59 to 6. The digits flipped in the blink of an eye. I slipped on my shoes and straightened my back. A new day waited at the door, quiet, light. I inhaled just enough, then exhaled. The rest, I would do one step at a time. Morning in the Pearl District. I walked slowly toward Stumptown. my palms still remembering the bitterness of last night's pill. The cafe door swung open, and the scent of freshly ground coffee rolled out like a wave of warm smoke. Exposed brick, long wooden tables, the low hum of an espresso machine fading into silence. I ordered an herbal tea, no sugar, and carried the tray to the back corner table. My back turned to the door so I wouldn't have to see anyone walk in. I opened my notebook. Today's page was for bare minimum expenses. Room, food, medicine, bus fare. I drew short, steady lines, calm handwriting. My other hand cupped the paper cup. The heat seeped through and into my wrist. My heartbeat slowed. I tilted my head, listening the clink of a spoon against a cup at the counter, the slap of rubber soles crossing the cement floor. The chair behind me scraped sharply, then stopped. A familiar scent of perfume drifted past, pulling up the memory of a kitchen afternoon, the weeks before everything broke. I didn't turn around. A woman's voice, lowered but edged with strain. "Jessica, that night almost fell apart when she came home early. Thank God you made it out the back door in time." A man's voice answered, short and deep. "What about Ethan?" Jessica exhaled. I heard the crinkle of a napkin twisted in her hands. "I just said she made me feel small." Cried a little, and he believed it. "If we want peace, she has to be gone." I sat perfectly straight. My cup froze midair, then lowered gently to the table. In the scattered cafe noise, each word from their table cut through the air, slipping across the wood grain and landing open on my notebook. I stared at the page, my pen already poised, as if waiting for this moment. I wrote, "Kitchen light on, back door, date, time." My hand didn't shake. I drew another line. "Ethan working late, same time?" And one more question. "Anyone see a stranger?" I paused, listening for more. Nothing but the soft hiss of a straw through a plastic lid and Jessica's curt tone ordering another drink. I didn't turn. I didn't need to see their faces to know what was true. I didn't stand up either. On this side of the chair, I had something I hadn't had the night before: my own breath, steady and intact. I added one more line, smaller. "Meet Avery." Avery Klein, the only person I could think of who could fit the scattered pieces of time back into their right boxes. I unlocked my phone, scrolled to his number. "I don't need to argue or defend myself," I said silently, word by word, fixing the sentence into place like a label for the day. "What I need is the truth." Right now, excuses would only thicken the smoke. I closed the notebook, keeping a finger on the page to mark it. My tea was still half full. I lifted it, drank slowly. A barista passed by, tray in hand, and asked quietly, "Can I get you anything else?" I smiled and shook my head. Just enough of a smile to erase the trace of what I'd overheard. I didn't want to leave any emotional portrait behind. I stood, carried my tray to the bin. The rough tile floor was cool, like river stone. I passed the counter. The espresso machine roared to life again. Outside, the early wind flicked the edge of the hanging menu. I tightened my grip on my bag and straightened my back. Nothing in the world had changed except the way I stood in it. I turned down a narrow alley leading to the main street. My heart held its rhythm. In the shade of a building, I stopped, pulled out my phone. Avery's name glowed on the screen, a quiet reminder of order. I pressed call. After 3 rings, his secretary answered, polite, efficient. I gave my name and asked for the soonest possible appointment. She confirmed a few details, and I replied briefly. "We can see you late this afternoon," she said. "Please bring any documents you have." "I'll bring them," I said. I hung up, holding the phone between my palms. The breeze lifted the collar of my coat. I felt as if a fine, straight line had just been drawn on the ground before me, clear and bright. I followed it, unhurried, without pause. The street opened up ahead. Portland's morning sky wasn't perfectly blue, but wide enough to see to the end of the day. I thought of the suitcase from last night, the door closing, the frantic rhythm of my heart. Now, that rhythm was back within reach. I gave myself one simple rule: every step must have a destination. I turned toward the bus stop. My phone buzzed, a soft vibration. An email, confirmation of my appointment with Avery's office. I opened it, read it twice, then put the phone away. My palms were dry. Above me, a streak of light deepened in the sky. I understood then. I just walked out of the darkest part of the night, not with a scream, but with a phone call. The rest would be work. Avery Klein's office in downtown Portland was as tidy as a catalog page, small conference room, whiteboard, printer by the window. I sat across from him, both hands resting on the edge of the table to keep steady. Avery flipped open a leather notebook and uncapped his pen. "I need the full picture," he said. "Last night I was kicked out right after my heart checkup," I replied. "When I got home, the door was open and my suitcase was already on the porch. This morning, at Stumptown, I sat at the back table. Jessica came in with a man. She said the night before they'd almost been caught, that he managed to slip out the back door. She said she cried, told Ethan she felt disrespected, and he believed her. The goal was to get me out for peace." Avery nodded, writing quickly. "The night you heard the back door, when was that?" "Last week. The kitchen light was still on. I heard a latch click in the backyard. Anyone who can confirm that?" "My neighbor, Linda Green. Her house faces our backyard." He paused his pen, then summarized in a flat tone, "We'll need evidence on 3 points. 1. Your contributions. 2. Her motive to force you out. 3. The affair." He looked up. "I'll keep this simple. Before a final ruling, the court can issue a temporary order to freeze assets so no one can move or hide property while the case is pending." I reached into my bag and placed a stack of clipped documents on the table. The kitchen renovation invoice under my name, a printed copy of Ethan's email asking for help, and bank statements showing my transfers to Turner Designs. Avery examined each page, marking the corners with sticky notes. "Good," he said. "The kitchen invoice proves you contributed to the house. The statements show your financial input into the company. The email provides context: who asked whom, when, and why." He pulled the whiteboard closer and drew 3 columns: assets, motive, affair. "Next step," Avery continued, "witnesses. I'll contact the owner of Stumptown, ask how often she meets that man, and what time of day. We'll need to confirm that those times match Ethan's usual overtime hours. I'll also call Mrs. Linda Green for a statement about the backdoor night." I nodded. "I still have Ethan's recent work schedule in my old email. He sent it with his production plans." I noted in my journal, "Print schedule, compare with Jessica's departure time." Avery checked his watch, calm as ever. "Just to reassure you, our request for a temporary order isn't about taking anything away. It's to preserve the current state until the court can rule fairly. If the documents hold up, your rights will be recognized." "I don't want this to turn into a circus," I said. "We'll bring order with paperwork," he replied. "The rest is patience." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Emma, call the owner of Stumptown. Ask about Jessica's visits with a man morning or afternoon, especially during slow hours. Note the most recent date. And connect me with Mrs. Linda Green at this address." He turned to me. "Give me her number and address." I read it aloud. He reminded me, "We only need what they saw, and remember, no speculation." Emma spoke briefly on the other end, then emailed back a call schedule. Avery turned to me again. "While we wait, let's list the evidence." He opened a file on his computer and typed bullet points. "Kitchen renovation invoice. Name. Margaret bank transfers to Turner Designs. Ethan's email. Ethan's work schedule. Cafe owner's testimony. Linda Green's testimony. Your timeline notes." He loaded paper into the printer tray. "I'll draft the court request to provisionally recognize your rights in the house and company, and to freeze certain work-related accounts until trial. The language will be direct and clear." "What do I need to do next?" I asked. 3 things. 1. Sign the authorization so I can represent you in court. 2. Send the originals of the invoices and statements. I'll scan and return them. 3. Write a brief handwritten timeline from memory, as short as possible. Just dates and events. Heart checkup, eviction, cafe, backdoor night. He tilted his head slightly. "You keep it short. I'll build from it." I opened my notebook and wrote 4 lines, dates aligned on the left margin. Avery read them and nodded. "That's enough. Thank you." The desk phone light blinked. Emma's voice came through. The cafe owner confirmed seeing Jessica several times with a man, usually during the slow afternoon hours. He's willing to provide his recent records and testify if needed. Mrs. Green got the message she'll call back later today. "Excellent," Avery said, then turned to me. "That's a good start. What about Ethan's schedule?" "I'll print it as soon as I get home," I said. "I remember the attached weekly plans." "Good. Match those times against the cafe owner's notes," he typed, reviewing each sentence aloud, trimming any extra words. His voice was steady, unbroken. "This wording is clear," he said, glancing up. "Does that sound right to you?" "I want it airtight," I replied. "Then it's right," he said with a faint smile. "Let's sign." Avery placed the papers before me, the authorization form, the evidence list, the motion for a temporary order. I took the pen. My hand was steady. My signature fit neatly inside the lines, slightly slanted, even strokes. He gathered the pages, clipped them into a folder, and dated the corner. Avery pressed the print key. The printer started up, pulling in paper black letters marching in straight lines, column after column. The first page slid into the tray, then the second, the third. The rhythmic sound was like a steady drumbeat. He took the seal, pressed it firmly onto the corner. The sound was sharp, final. The last page slid out. The red stamp dried quickly on the paper. Avery stacked the files, sliding one copy toward me and keeping the other for the office. "The case file is ready," he said. 3 weeks passed, like pages torn too quickly from a calendar. The afternoon in the lodging lobby was still as a pond. I set my cup of warm water on the low table, sat upright, and listened to my heartbeat through the thin fabric of my sweater. The glass door opened. Ethan stepped in, his shoes stopping on the edge of the welcome mat. He glanced around the quiet room, as if afraid of disturbing someone, then walked toward me. His left hand turned his wedding ring, an old habit. "Mom," he hesitated. "If you'd just say something to Jess, things would be easier. The family needs peace." I pointed to the chair across from me. "Sit down first. Have a drink with me, then we'll talk." Ethan took the cup but didn't drink, holding it just to keep his hands busy. I pulled a cardboard file folder from my cloth bag and set it on the table. The light reflected off its edge like a thin blade. "Don't worry about explaining," I said slowly. "I didn't ask you here to argue. I want you to look at this." I opened the folder. The first page was the kitchen renovation invoice under my name, followed by bank statements showing transfers to Turner Designs, then a printed copy of the email he once sent me. At the bottom were the court's temporary order filing and a small sheet listing the Stumptown morning timeline. Ethan flipped through each page. His expression shifted like clouds gathering before dusk. His thumb stopped on a line of bank transactions, then moved to the email. A hint of red rimmed his eyes, but he blinked it away. "I don't want to dig up the past," I said, "but this is what I put into your home and your company. I just need you to read it." He closed the folder and exhaled through his nose. I waited a few seconds, then slid the small sheet toward him. "Have you ever asked yourself why she didn't want me in that house?" Ethan stayed silent. The light fell on his cheekbone, leaving a faint shadow. He looked down at his hands. The ring turned again. "The morning after you threw me out," I said, "I was sitting at the back of Stumptown. I heard her tell a man about the night he ran out the back door. She said she cried, told you she was being disrespected, and you believed her. The goal was to get me out." Ethan's chest rose and fell in short bursts. He avoided my eyes, setting the cup down gently, a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. "I just wanted peace at home," he said, his voice scraping against his throat. "After Dad died, I was afraid of losing whatever peace was left." "Wanting peace doesn't mean throwing out the one person who told the truth," I said evenly. Ethan's fingers pressed into his knees, knuckles whitening. "I'm just tired of being stuck between you two," he murmured, barely loud enough for me to hear. "You could have chosen to ask," I replied. "Just one question. What happened?" "But you didn't." The air conditioner let out a cool gust. The wall clock ticked forward one notch. We sat there quietly, not fighting, just laying the heavy pieces on the table, seeing them finally in their right names. I closed the folder. "I'm taking the legal route to protect what's mine. I don't need anyone to lose or shout. I just want things put in their rightful place. As for you, you'll have to face your own truth." Ethan nodded, not arguing. He stood, straightened his collar. At the doorway, he paused as if he wanted to say more, then didn't. The glass door closed behind him, reflecting my silhouette alone at the table. I slipped the folder back into my bag, smoothing its corner flat with my thumb. My heart no longer raced. It simply felt heavy, like a weight finally settled in its tray. The phone in my pocket buzzed softly. I pulled it out. A new email from the court. Concise and precise date. Time, courtroom. The first hearing was scheduled. I read it twice. The feeling was the same as hearing Avery's printer, the steady rhythm that demanded no emotion. I saved the event to my calendar, set a reminder for the day before, and turned off the screen. At the reception desk, The clerk looked up with a smile. I nodded back, borrowing that smile like one borrows a flame from another candle. I picked up my now cold cup, took a sip, and let the bland taste slide down my throat. Outside, the late sunlight stretched long across the parking lot, like lines drawn by a ruler. I stood, adjusted my jacket. The straight path I'd marked that morning at the cafe now had a red milestone on it. I walked toward my room, each step measured, steady, hearing my heartbeat keep time for a statement that would be clear, brief, and sufficient. The rest the court would hear, the papers would speak, and the truth would stand on its own. Late night in Ethan's kitchen. The light was dim and yellow, spread thin like a coat of paint. Jessica leaned against the counter, holding a piece of paper covered in a long string of numbers. "I've changed the Wi-Fi password," she said evenly. "And I want to lock the study. The client files need to stay private." Ethan pulled out a chair but didn't sit. "I use that room too." "Then you have a key," Jessica said, placing a new padlock on the table. "And one more thing. I don't want anyone coming into the house unannounced, especially after everything that's happened." "No one's coming in, not even Mom?" Ethan asked, his eyes fixed on the lock like it was something foreign. Jessica exhaled slowly. "If you keep letting her in, I'll move out. I'm tired." "I don't want anyone leaving this house," Ethan said. He turned his wedding ring, his index finger trembling once before stilling. "Don't turn this into a trench war." "The trench started when she made this house a place for judgment," Jessica said, sliding the password note closer to his elbow. "Make a choice, peace or chaos." Ethan looked at the paper, then at the lock. He nodded, barely a gesture that felt more like surrender than agreement. Early morning at Turner Designs, the glow of the monitor painted Ethan's face in pale blue. The office was so quiet that the sound of his computer booting up felt like paper tearing. He opened his old inbox to find a client contract template. An email popped up, its subject line too familiar. "Mom, only you can save me." Ethan clicked. His own words from 2 years ago filled the screen, urgent, pleading. Below them, her reply, "Bring the invoices tomorrow." He leaned back, covering his mouth with his hand. "Why do I blame the person who saved me?" The question hit him hard, sharp, and heavy, like a stone wedged under a wheel. He pulled open a drawer and took out an old printout, edges yellowed with time. Beside it lay this month's project calendar, squares tangled with marker lines. He placed the old email on top of it, like laying a photograph of the past over the measurements of the present. The empty squares revealed the nights he'd worked late, the hours he couldn't bear to look at for long. His phone vibrated. The screen read Mom. Ethan stood abruptly, pressed call, and lifted the phone to his ear. The ring sounded once, twice, 3 times. He swallowed hard and hung up. His hand twisted the ring on his finger until it hurt. Outside, clouds stretched in long gray bands like lines of words he once wrote but couldn't remember writing, out of fear. He set the phone down, sat again, opened the contract file. The cursor blinked. He typed a few words, deleted them. Finally, he printed his work schedule and clipped it together, a reflex, as if placing evidence quietly on his own desk, for no one else to see. That night, the house felt colder than the kitchen had the evening before. Jessica scrolled quickly through her phone, stopped on a new email, her lips pressed into a thin line. "So you're letting your mother drag me into court?" she said, voice sharp as a blade. Ethan stood at the sink, hands still wet. "The court's reviewing everyone's rights. The truth will come out." "What rights?" "I'm your wife. I've taken care of this home." Jessica slammed a cabinet door. "I've had enough. And now, you want to talk about rights?" "What's wrong with you, Ethan?" The cabinet door rattled once in its frame. Ethan set down the towel and turned. "Calm down. Don't make a scene. If you've done nothing wrong, there's nothing to be angry about. I've got clients to meet tomorrow." "I don't care about your clients," Jessica said, brushing past him like a gust of cold air. "I only care about one thing, whether this house is on my side." Ethan said nothing. The new padlock still sat on the table, unused. Jessica glanced at it, smirked faintly, then put it on, for the sake of security. She turned and climbed the stairs, her heels striking each step in rhythm. Ethan stood alone in the kitchen. He dried his hands, reached for the new password note, and tucked it into a drawer. His phone screen lit up a text from the court, confirmation of the hearing the next morning. He read it, shoulders sagging, then straightened again. He picked up the printed schedule from that morning, slid it into a black folder, and placed it beside his car keys. Inside the house, the air conditioner shifted its hum. Upstairs, Jessica's footsteps stopped, then silence. Ethan turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark a few seconds, letting his eyes adjust. He touched his wedding ring again, placed a hand over his chest. His heartbeat was steady but heavy. He unlocked his phone, scrolled through his contacts. My name was still there, faintly glowing among the list of family numbers. He didn't call. He just set the alarm 10 minutes earlier to give himself time to stop for coffee on the way to court. When the screen went dark, his reflection lingered in the glass door, fragmented but outlined. By morning, that outline would have to stand in the light. I sat on the edge of a bench along the gray stone hallway of the Multnomah County Courthouse, the case file resting on my lap, my fingertips tracing the edge of the papers to keep rhythm. Avery stood beside me, shoulders straight, eyes fixed on the electronic board outside the courtroom door. Ethan stepped out of the elevator with Jessica. He looked at me and gave the slightest nod, just enough to acknowledge me. Jessica tugged on his arm, turning toward the window, her face sealed tight, betraying nothing. "Keep a steady pace. Answer only what's asked," Avery murmured, like reminding me to fasten a seatbelt. I nodded, inhaled to a count of 4. The courtroom door opened. We entered. Before the judge's bench, Avery presented the tabbed binder, each divider labeled with a colored note, House Company Timeline. He laid one copy on the opposing counsel's table and handed another to the court. "This is the kitchen renovation invoice under my client's name, Margaret Turner," Avery said, pointing to the signature line with his pen. "These are the bank statements showing her transfers to Turner Designs during financial hardship. And this," he continued, "is an email from Ethan Turner to my client." He turned toward the judge, his voice even and low. "These represent consistent and verifiable contributions. We ask the court to recognize them." The opposing lawyer flipped through the documents quickly, careful not to touch the colored tabs like avoiding tripwires. I kept my eyes on the edge of the table, watching the vein at my wrist rise, then fade. Avery added nothing more. The papers spoke for themselves. The Stumptown Cafe owner took the witness stand. He removed his cap, placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and stood upright. "Mr. Hayes," Avery began, "did you observe Jessica visiting your cafe regularly with an unfamiliar man?" "Yes," he said, "usually during slow hours, afternoons." "Can you describe him, generally?" "Taller than her by a head, short hair, dark jacket, running shoes." Avery didn't turn his head. "And those visits, did they coincide with her husband, Ethan Turner, working overtime?" "Most of the time, yes," the owner replied without hesitation. From the other bench, I heard the faint shuffle of papers. Jessica gripped her purse strap tight, her face angled toward the window as if checking the weather. I kept my breathing steady and didn't look at Ethan. Then came Linda Green. She wore a heavy coat and spoke clearly, like recounting a familiar walking route. "That night, I was on my back porch," Linda said. "The kitchen light next door was still on. I heard the back door click. A man I didn't recognize stepped out, moving fast across the low fence, never looking around. The opposing attorney stepped forward slightly. "Did you get a clear look at his face, Mrs. Green?" "No," Linda answered. "But his build and timing matched the sound of the door. I've lived there long enough to know when their lights usually go out." Avery nodded once, asked nothing further. He let the statement stay right where it was, a pin pressed neatly into the wall of time. The opposing lawyer stood and offered a thin smile. "Your Honor, all of this could easily be coincidence. A busy cafe, an open backyard path. None of it warrants a leap to conclusion." Avery turned to Jessica. "Then why," he asked, "was your mother-in-law, Margaret Turner, asked to leave the house at the very moment you said you needed peace?" Jessica lifted her chin, eyes flashing. "If she hadn't been snooping, none of this would have happened." A murmur rippled through the room. Pens from the press row tapped softly on paper, tiny exclamation marks. I heard the judge clear her throat, raising a hand for order. Ethan bowed his head, fingers interlaced, thumb circling his wedding ring slowly, then stopping, then again. Avery didn't pursue the outburst. He took half a step back, lowering his gaze to the binder as if the assembly was complete. I understood the cue, let her words reveal the gap herself. Near the end, Avery stepped to the center table. "Your Honor," he said succinctly, "based on the submitted evidence and testimony, we request a temporary order recognizing my client's interest in the shared property and company equity, and freezing related accounts to preserve the current state pending judgment. The opposing lawyer made a token objection, speaking of family, harmony, avoiding disruption. I looked down at the wood grain on the table, the lines flowing like dried rivers. Calm passed through me like a long shadow. The judge reviewed the documents, then delivered her ruling. Her voice was clear, neither harsh nor soft. The court grants a temporary order recognizing Mrs. Margaret Turner's provisional rights to the disputed assets. The court further orders the preservation of specified Turner Designs accounts pending trial. Both parties are to comply. No transfer or alteration of assets is permitted. In that instant, every sound seemed to step back. I could hear the clerk's pen marking the ledger, the faint creak of a chair behind me, Avery's slow, measured exhale. I didn't smile. I simply placed my palm flat on the case file, feeling the smooth paper become solid ground. Jessica shot to her feet too quickly. Her purse strap slipped off her shoulder, then jerked back. She turned to Ethan. "You see?" Her voice came out in broken bursts, like speaking into the wind. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were on the judge's bench, but I knew he was staring at another wall entirely, one built inside himself. Avery gathered the files, tilting his head slightly toward me. "That's it for this part." We stepped back from the table and walked down the center aisle. When I stood, my knees didn't shake. My heart didn't pound against my ribs like it had that night on the porch. It beat steady, calm like the sound of that printer a few days ago. In the hallway, the light spilled across the gray stone floor. I stood long enough for the hem of my coat to stop trembling. Ethan walked Jessica toward the door, then halted. She tugged his arm again, but he stayed still. She walked a few paces ahead, turned back, saw him unmoved, and stormed close to hiss something, eyes blazing. At last, she spun sharply and headed for the elevator. Ethan lifted his face, searching for me through the movement of people. Our eyes met, no words. Just a look held a heartbeat longer than usual, long enough to hear something crack softly inside the silence. Avery touched my elbow lightly, signaling it was time to go. I nodded, lifted the file. My footsteps echoed evenly across the stone floor, each one like driving a nail into the path ahead. Behind me, the elevator doors closed a clean, metallic sound. I inhaled for 4 counts, exhaled for 6, and walked on. Avery's office was as quiet as a breathing exercise room. He spread the case file across the table and drew 3 clean lines on a blank sheet with a marker. Contributions, expulsion from home, Jessica's motive. "We'll stick to this axis," Avery said. "You describe everything in order. No personal judgments. When you're asked a question, answer it directly, then stop." I nodded. He handed me a sheet of practice questions, repeating the rhythm. Slow, clear, let the document speak. I scanned the page again. Kitchen invoice, capital transfers, email. The night I was thrown out, the morning at Stumptown, the call to him. Every anchor point sat exactly where it belonged. The courtroom was fuller than last time. I stood at the witness stand, hands lightly resting on the wooden rail. "Mrs. Margaret Turner," the clerk called. Avery gave a small nod. I faced forward. "I'd like you to present your timeline," the judge said. "I had a heart checkup that afternoon," I began. "When I came home, my suitcase was on the porch. My son opened the door and told me I should leave. The next morning, I went to Stumptown Cafe in the Pearl District, sat in the back. I overheard my daughter-in-law speaking to a man, saying that the night before he'd managed to run out the back door. She cried and said she'd been disrespected, and my son believed her. The goal was to push me out of the house for peace. After that, I contacted attorney Avery Klein and gave him my documents. The kitchen renovation invoice under my name, the transfer records to Turner Designs, and the email my son once sent me. I paused briefly, then added, "I'm not here to accuse. I'm asking the court to protect what I contributed and the truth." The courtroom fell completely still. Then Ethan took the stand. He placed his hand on the rail, still twisting his wedding ring once before stopping. Avery went straight to the point. "Did you verify any information before asking your mother to leave the house?" Ethan looked at the microphone, voice low. "No. I acted too quickly. I was afraid my home would fall apart." "Falling apart is not the same as throwing an innocent person out," Avery said, tone even. "Do you agree?" A brief silence. "I understand." Ethan answered. I looked down at the floor to give my heartbeat somewhere to rest. The words I understand were short but heavy. The blind shield dropped, landing somewhere deep in the quiet. Jessica stepped forward, shoulders square, eyes cold. Avery didn't circle around. We have the cafe owner's confirmation of repeated meetings between you and an unidentified man during slow afternoon hours, he said. Mrs. Linda Green's statement about a man leaving through the back gate while the kitchen light was still on, and a timeline matching the night my client was expelled. You said you needed peace. My question is peace from what? I just wanted clean air, Jessica said sharply. Avery tilted his head slightly, eyes fixed on her. Clean from what truth, or the person who discovered it? Jessica turned away. No reply. Pens from the reporter's row clicked briefly, then stopped. The opposing counsel interjected with a few words about assumptions and coincidences, but the timeline had already closed. I stood beside Avery, eyes on the wood grain before me, keeping my breath even. The judge reviewed the files again, her eyes moving across the color tabs. Then she looked up. Based on the evidence, consistent testimony, and matching timelines, she said firmly, the court recognizes Mrs. Margaret Turner as owning 50% of Turner Designs and the corresponding value of the disputed home. The court will maintain preservation measures on specific related accounts until all subsequent procedures are completed. Both parties are to comply, no transfers, no reduction of asset value. The air seemed to lose all motion. I could hear the clerk's pen drawing a line across the ledger, the faint creak of a chair in the back row. I closed the file folder, fingertips brushing the smooth paper, my palms dry. Jessica shot up from her seat, chair scraping loudly against the floor. She snatched her handbag and strode out so fast her hair brushed her shoulders. The door at the back opened. A rush of cold hallway air swept in for a moment. Ethan stood frozen. His face was turned toward the bench, but I knew he was staring into another kind of space, an inner one. Avery touched my elbow lightly, as before. It's done, he said quietly. His expression showed no triumph, no gloating, just confirmation. We stepped away from the bench. I breathed steadily. Each step felt like laying a brick. No need to look down. The courtroom door closed behind us with a clean click. In the corridor, white light fell on the gray stone floor, cold but clear. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass door, standing straight, file held close to my side. At the far end of the hall, Ethan still stood there. He seemed about to approach, then stopped like someone realizing he needed to learn his words before speaking. I didn't call out. I left the distance where it belonged. As I passed him, our eyes met for 1 second, long enough to say, "Choose the truth, starting now." I walked on. My heartbeat followed each step. Not fast, not slow. At the main doors, I drew in a deeper breath of outside air. There was no smell of antiseptic, no scent of varnished wood, only the clean, cold air of Portland at noon. I tilted my head toward the sky and lifted the file a little higher, as if raising something that had just been given its rightful name. The rest the papers had already spoken. I kept my part where it belonged, and I breathed. That afternoon I stood across the street from the old house. Jessica's car was gone. A rented SUV pulled up to the curb. The rear door opened, handbags, shoeboxes. A few photo frames were hurriedly loaded inside. Jessica crossed the lawn without looking around. She tossed a bag onto the seat, slammed the door wood cracking against metal. One of the window curtains hung crooked. I didn't move closer. I stood far enough away from my heartbeat to stay steady, watching what used to be called a home get packed up like leftover stock. When the vehicles pulled away, silence rose over the porch. Only then did I cross the street. The door was ajar. Ethan sat on the couch in the dark. He wasn't turning his ring anymore. Both hands rested on his knees. On the wall, a strip of chipped paint exposed an old white square. The wall clock ticked in dry, hollow beats pressing against the emptiness. "You should turn on the light," I said. He looked up, flipped the switch. The yellow glow opened onto a room half emptied. Dust streaked the shelves. I didn't ask if there'd been an argument. Ethan didn't explain. We stood in this new kind of distance, enough to hear each other, not enough to accuse. The cafe near Ethan's studio had only 3 tables. I arrived a few minutes early. A handwritten sign on the counter read, "Hot drinks only." Ethan came in wearing a black coat, eyes hollow but alert. He set my cup down, sat across from me, and stayed silent for a moment as if choosing his words carefully. "I let fear run my life," he said at last, plain and direct. I wrapped my hands around the mug for warmth. "Knowing when to stop means you still have a way back." He nodded. No excuses, no buts. We took our first sip together. The heat loosened our throats enough to swallow the unnecessary words. Inside, the grinder whirred once, then stopped. Outside, wind swept the cafe sign. "I'll arrange to sell the house," Ethan said. "I need to settle what should be settled." I only nodded. My cup was half full. We sat for a few more quiet minutes. When we stood, I touched his shoulder lightly, a gesture that said what needed saying: "Keep going, but go straight." Within a few weeks, a for sale sign stood on the front lawn. The agent brought strangers in and out. Unfamiliar footsteps tested the wood floors, as if to see whether the rhythm of a life could be bought. I signed my part at the attorney's office. Ethan signed his face showing nothing larger than his signature. After a long process, the sale was finalized. The new owners received their keys. That afternoon, under a sky heavy with rain, Ethan placed the old keyring into my palm. I didn't keep it. I set it on the doorstep, the way one lays down a baby tooth that's ready to fall away. Ethan's new apartment sat on the third floor of a brick building, a few blocks from his studio. The living room was small, clean, with a window facing the trees. Boxes were still half open. He hung a framed photo on the wall, 3 of us at a park years ago. Me in a knit hat, my husband smiling with squinted eyes, Ethan holding a red kite. The picture touched the wall with a faint sound. He stepped back and said softly, like a vow to himself, "I'll learn to ask for the truth before I choose sides." I noticed the therapy appointment card on the fridge, date and time written neatly in black marker. Beside it was a short list: breakfast, exercise 20 minutes, revisit session notes. Those words didn't ask for anyone's belief, they simply marked a person relearning how to stand upright. "That's good," I said. "Long roads need steady steps." We opened a box together, 4 porcelain bowls, 1 wooden spoon. The small sounds in the kitchen were clean, like fresh-washed cloth. By late afternoon, we sat by the window. The light traced a soft outline around the photo frame. I spoke first, to keep the boundary clear. "Forgiveness isn't erasing," I said. "It's a fence that keeps us safe. From here on, each of us carries our own part." Ethan looked out the window, head tilted slightly. "I understand. I'll walk the long road, no shortcuts." "Slow and steady," I said. "And before any decision, ask yourself, what's the truth?" He smiled faintly. Not an apology to me, an apology to the part of himself that once didn't know better. I stood, put on my coat. "I have a meeting with the lawyer tomorrow," I said. "I'll update you after." We stepped into the hallway. The elevator rose, doors opening to reflect the 2 of us. I placed my hand on his shoulder for a second, then let go. As the doors closed, I caught our reflection like a new map forming, one where the road between mother and son no longer ran parallel to fear. On the bus, my phone buzzed. An email from Avery. "The profit share transfer is ready. You may begin implementing the fund plan you proposed." I read it twice. The lines were short, clear, to the point. Outside the window, the city receded. I slipped the phone into my bag, leaned back, and felt my heartbeat steady like a clock newly wound to the right time. The next chapter already had its place. I touched the edge of my notebook inside my purse, a new page waiting. Kennebunkport greeted me with a salty breeze seeping through the cracks of the door. Dawn hadn't yet broken over the sea, just a faint thread of light along the horizon. I turned on the kitchen light, boiled water, and set up a paper filter. The freshly ground coffee filled the air with a warm scent, mingling with the faint wood smell of the new apartment. On the table, my heart medication was neatly arranged by day, next to a pulse logbook and a simple pen. When the water boiled, I poured it slowly, listening to the steady drip, a quiet kind of background music. The cup filled, the dark surface trembling slightly. I opened the balcony door. The early wind hit my face, salt stung. Waves crashed against the rocks, leaving trails of white foam. I held the cup, leaning against the railing, my back straight. My heart beat in sync with the water's rhythm, steady, unhurried. In this quiet stillness, the past drifted back, smoothed down like stones shaped by the tide. I went inside, set the cup down beside the medicine box, swallowed my morning pill, and checked the little box in my logbook. Taken. Each small act was a contract I signed with myself. On the dining table sat a stack of documents just arrived from the law office: fund verification papers, a bank appointment letter, and a list of first-round beneficiaries proposed by a local sociology group. I sat down and opened them one by one. The fund's name was simple and plain, no trace of self-congratulation. Under purpose, only a few lines: to support older women who had been cast out, emotionally abused, and needed a solid place to begin again. I ran my hand over the paper, feeling the faint emboss of the seal. That afternoon, I went to the bank to sign off on the final transfer of profit shares. The manager led me to her office, handed me a tidy folder, and walked me through each step. We reviewed the terms one last time, checked the schedule for automatic transfers. My signature sat neatly in the little boxes at the bottom of each page, quiet punctuation marks at the end of a long sentence. After some time, the fund began its first round of distributions. The list in my hand had 5 names, each carrying a story that didn't need to be told in full. An elderly woman expelled from her daughter-in-law's home, a retired woman cut off financially, a widow needing temporary housing during a family dispute. We arranged short-term shelter, grocery cards for 3 months, and a few basic therapy sessions. Leaning back, I imagined them setting their bags down on clean floors, opening a new door without asking anyone's permission. That evening, I returned to my apartment, turned on the warm light, filed away the papers, and poured myself another glass of warm water. On the shelf sat a small wooden box, a keepsake box. Inside were my hospital results tucked into my health log, a few old photos, and an empty space reserved for something not yet here. On my 3rd day there, the mailman knocked. A cream-colored envelope, familiar handwriting. I sat at the table and opened it. I'm learning to pause before I believe. Each week I go to therapy, writing down the moments I dodge questions out of fear. I'm practicing telling the truth, even when it makes me look worse in my own eyes. Now, reading back through the timeline, I understand you did what you had to do. If you'll allow it, I'd like to visit at the end of autumn, just to listen to the waves with you. I set the letter down, smoothing the edge flat with my fingers. A tired, peaceful smile rose and fell like a soft wave touching the rocks. I folded the letter, slid it into the wooden box beside the hospital report, 2 sheets of paper on opposite ends, one reminding me to live slowly, the other showing someone else learning how to breathe right. At night, I stepped back onto the balcony. The sky shifted from pale blue to gray-purple. Fishing boats offshore lit their tiny specks of light. The wind changed direction, carrying the scent of pine from inland. I touched the hospital report, reread the first few lines, then closed it. None of the words were threats, they were instructions. I had chosen to listen. Leaning on the railing, I let my mind settle. The courtroom voices, the stamped papers, the closing doors, all of it receded to its proper shelves. I thought, justice isn't who shouts the loudest. It's what stands in the right place, under the right name. I had walked a long corridor of noise, and in the end, found the only door that opened was the one that didn't need to make a sound. Justice isn't a fire, I whispered. It's a clean cut in the right place. The rest truth takes care of itself. It was the final note in a notebook that had run out of pages. I went inside and closed the window softly. The sea kept breaking against the rocks outside, needing no witness. Late morning light slipped across the room onto the table, the half-finished cup, the row of medicine bottles. I turned off the lamp, letting only daylight fill the space. Here, the new rhythm of life didn't ask for proof. It only asked that I take my pills on time, walk the shoreline, answer letters in the afternoon, and at night sleep before my heart begins to measure the old days again. Tomorrow, I'll meet with the fund's coordination team to plan the next round of aid. Tomorrow night, if the wind stays still, I'll reread Ethan's letter before putting it away. I closed the wooden box and set it on the shelf. From the balcony came the sound of water brushing rock, steady, simple, precise, like the tick of a minute hand. And I stood there, breathing, knowing the story had found its place, not loud, but clear enough to light the way. The story you've just heard is fictional, but every breath, every heartbeat, every line in Margaret Turner's file carries the shape of real women out there. Women who endured quietly, then one day stood up not to reclaim power, but to reclaim dignity. Names and details have been changed to protect those who might be recognized. We tell this story not to glorify a strong mother, but to remind you, Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a verdict. It begins the moment a woman decides not to stay silent anymore. When she says, "Enough," the world around her has no choice but to listen. If you've ever been pushed aside simply for speaking the truth, this is your reminder. You are not alone. Leave a comment if you believe truth doesn't need to shout to be heard, it only needs to stand firm and not back down. And if you believe justice isn't the hammer's blow, but the steady heartbeat that follows the storm, share this video. Somewhere out there, someone might find the courage to start again. Don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is living proof that silence protects no one, but truth can save an entire life. On the final screen, we bring you 2 more stories of ordinary people who chose truth over fear. I promise you won't be able to look away.